July 18th, 1943. Sicily was a furnace under a pale sun, dust rising in the wake of tracks and boots, the air tasting of hot metal and oil. In the heat of that summer, the Allied columns clawed forward through olive groves and potato fields, Shermans and half-tracks rolling like a slow thunder, radio static, and the metallic cough of diesels threading the day. It was in that month and on that day that technician fourth grade Clint Walker, grease on his knuckles and a grin that never quite reached his eyes, strapped a contraption made from scavenged tank parts and empty fuel drums into the back of a Jeep and earned a kind of immortality the Army manual could never have predicted. Clint had been an armorer and a tinkerer long before they pinned the rank on his chest. He had been born to fix things that were meant to be fixed and to dream up fixes for things the world assumed unfixable. In the 41st Armored Engineers, he had become the man who could make a Sherman run on bad days, splice a stubborn radio, jury-rig a Browning M2 mount back into line. What he could not fix, he could fashion into a problem the enemy might not expect. They called his invention Clint's stupid trick. They laughed. Laughter in war is a kind of prayer, and in July of 43, that prayer was thin on answers. The column stalled at midday in a dry riverbed where the road pinched between low stone walls and a lone farmhouse. Across a shallow valley, 5 German Panzers, Panzer IVs, their long 7.5-centimeter guns bobbing like the necks of great steel beasts, had taken position behind a copse of carob trees, coaxed into hull-down positions with clever camouflage. They were supported by a platoon of Panzer grenadiers tucked into the ruined farmhouse, and a single MG-42 sang from a rooftop now and then like a throat clearing. Baker Company had tried to run the road and had been thrown back by the accuracy of German fire. The Sherman's 75mm rounds glanced off the frontal armor of the Panzers unless they found the thinner sides. The road was the lifeline, the road was cut. Orders moved down the line. Engineers on the flank would find a way. Sherman crews grumbled about movement orders. Lieutenant Harper of the Engineers scrawled on a grease-stained map and cursed softly. Clint Walker, watching the column and the scar the 5 Panzers made across the landscape, felt that old hum in his teeth, the urge to invent, to outthink rather than outshoot. He had no illusions about the metal they faced. He had seen what a 7.5-centimeter KWK-40 could do to a Sherman's hull. He also knew what human patterns did. Men checked wrecks, crews exposed themselves to assess damage. Armorers poked and prodded what they thought were friendly machines. Clint's stupid trick was an invitation. It was a staged retreat. A Jeep with a simulated crew's personal gear, a mangled radio with fake distress beeps, a belly of fuel drums wired together to act as a timed incendiary, and a remote detonator made from a transmitter salvaged from a broken SCR-300 and the guts of an automobile ignition coil. Around the main drum he rigged smaller explosive charges fashioned from C2 plastic, blocks of TNT, and satchel charges wired in series. He strung copper across the road like veins, disguised pressure plates beneath loose stones where a tank's tread might compress them, and he wrapped a chain of fuel-soaked burlap that would, once ignited, send fire crawling between tanks like a hungry snake. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Lure the Panzers close, thinking the Jeep and its cargo were the spoils of a skirmish, trigger a chain reaction with enough incendiary force to ignite fuel stores, ricochet shrapnel into vulnerable tracks and engine decks, and let the fight with 5 metal giants become a fight with flames. Men called it stupid because it used the enemy's psychology as a weapon. The notion that a German crew trained to respect the battlefield, but also to plunder, would leave the safety of its hull to check a smoking wreck That they would cluster in curiosity or confidence was a risky bet, but war is as much about betting on human behavior as it is about ballistics. Clint bet that surprise, misdirection, and a row of carefully placed charges could turn the Panzer's confidence into carnage. At dusk, the engineers moved. Clint's jeep rolled slowly toward the bend in the road while Sherman's took up false positions to suggest a retreat. The farmhouse's windows glinted with the glimmer of German optics. The 5 Panzer IVs watched, their commanders counting on a predictable prize. The jeep shuddered into place, smoke curling from an intentionally damaged radiator. A half-track left a trail of tools and a boot, the kind of careless debris soldiers abandon when running for their lives. Clint disembarked, wiped his hands on his shirt, and walked away toward the scrub, leaving the jeep to tell the story he wanted the enemy to read. American retreat, abandoned equipment, a casualty ripe for looting. Night settled earlier under the mountain shadow, thick and merciless, but the heat of the day lingered in the rocks, keeping the air shimmering. The Germans moved with the professionalism their doctrine demanded. They sent one Panther, no, not a Panther, an inspector in a Panzer IV, to investigate. They were careful at first, probing with a soldier whose flashlight swept across the jeep's dented hood and the scattered helmets. Curiosity is a currency on the battlefield, worth more than any coin, and sometimes more than a life. When the man signaled the others, the first chain reaction began. The German who stepped too close to the pressure plate found the world rearranged by a calculated explosion that sent wood and metal into the sky and painted the stone walls with smoke. The 1st Panzer's crew, thinking they would secure a prize, clustered along the flank to observe the wreck. They were veteran men seasoned by Tunisia and skirmishes in Calabria, but they were also men whose reactions had been trained toward inspection and salvage. The blast peeled panels and set the air alight with a smell that Clint would remember for years: diesel, hot leather, hydraulic fluid, and the cleaner metallic scent of scorched wiring. The nearby Panzer's engine couplings took shrapnel to their idling hearts. A track link was severed. The black rubber shank sloughed away like a skin. Clint's trick was not a single bomb. It was a mimed catastrophe. Small charges that would ignite fuel drums, incendiary charges to cook the engine decks, and well-placed shrapnel charges whose fragments sought the soft parts of armor. Optics, turret rings, the vulnerable sides where storage boxes had been lashed. The second big boom came when a hidden satchel struck a barrel of stored fuel and lit it like a fuse. Flames licked and thermal columns rose, making the night into an inferno and painting the olive trees with orange. The Baker Company men watched from their emplacements as the 5 Panzers, so confident minutes earlier, became combustible monuments. The Shermans, once threatened with frontal shots and long-range shells, now had a corridor. The 1st Panzer, immobilized by a shattered final drive, became a burning tomb. The 2nd lost its turret ring to a fragmentation blast, the 7.5-centimeter gun grinding uselessly as the men inside scrambled. Metal warped. Tracks melted. Crewmen who had once laughed at a stupid trick now bled and cursed and tried to carry what little they could salvage from the searing metal. Clint walked the edge of the smoke, feeling the heat on his face like a hand from an older life. He had not wanted to be a hero. He had only wanted to keep the column moving without throwing Sherman crews into a meat grinder. He knew the names of the weapons around him as intimately as a lover. The 75mm M3 the Shermans carried, the .50 caliber Brownings that pitter-pattered from the half-track's ring mount, the rasp of an M1 Garand when it barked in the hands of a flanking infantryman. He knew the smell of a bazooka reload when a man reached into a canvas bag and felt for the rocket. The M1A1's warhead small but precise enough to send a tank's belly to breakfast. The third Panzer tried to back away, its driver blinded by smoke and a dislocated track. The fourth, too close, took a burst of shrapnel into its engine plate. The fifth crew, perhaps the youngest, perhaps those who still believed in the invincibility of steel, tried to eject an unexploded shell and find a way to fire. In those long minutes, a small miracle of misapplied ingenuity unfolded. A German loader, bent over a jammed traverse, was pinned by heat and shrapnel. His neighbor tried to pull him free and fell into the path of flame. Men become portraits in these hours, heroes and cowards made equal by the randomness of shrapnel and the mathematics of chance. By midnight, the 5 Panzers were either ablaze or silent hulks, their silhouettes black against an angry sky. The farmhouse had been gutted by small arms, fire, and mortar splinters. The Panzer grenadiers who had sheltered there were scattered or taken prisoner. Baker Company moved through the gap Clint's trick had opened, Sherman's returning to the road as if their armor had been given new blessings. They pressed forward into the night, engines low, and the convoy found itself pouring down a corridor of stone and olive trees that had been, only hours before, a dead end. In the aftermath, Clint walked among the wrecks like a man at a scrapyard inspecting his handiwork. He saw the small human tragedies, dog tags melted to the ground like leaves, a boot with a toe blown off, a folded photograph burned and barely legible, with the name of a wife in Berlin scrawled in faded ink. He thought of the men inside the tanks. He imagined their lives before the war and wondered which of them would end up in the silent ledger of soldiers lost. War is geometry and chemistry and brutal patterns, but it is also lives compressed into shining seconds of decision. The engineers who had once laughed now watched Clint with a new kind of respect. Sergeant Reese, who had grinned at Clint's nonsense, touched the technician's shoulder and looked at him as if he had seen a small god. Lieutenant Harper wrote a terse report later about an ambush and enemy armor neutralized, but in the quiet later, when the camp had been pitched and the men had eaten cold rations and scratched at letters home, Clint sat alone by the remnants of a barrel fire and tried to sleep. He thought of the mechanism he had constructed, the transmitter, the ignition coil, the copper wiring that had sung when the trigger closed, and he felt the odd sensation of someone who has made a thing that would otherwise not exist. He felt the cost of it, too, the knowledge that invention in war always leaves its reckoning in the bodies and bones of men. The story of that night spread in rugged, half-laughed variations. Around field tables, men told the tale in different keys. Some called it brilliance, some called it luck. A few whispered that Clint had been playing God. Newspapers later would distill it into a paragraph. A small triumph among thousands, the kind of anecdote that decorated debriefs, but in the mud and the heat, in the smoke-streaked face of a man who had seen flames eat through armor, the truth was quieter. A trick had been played on 5 German Panzers because one technician had noticed a pattern in how men responded to promises of salvage, and because he had the tools and the nerve to turn that pattern into a trap. The 5 tanks were a tactical problem solved without the artillery curtain that often bled a division dry. It was a solution that cost nothing more than scrap, nerve, and a reckless faith in human predictability. The Shermans that followed the open road owed their forward push not only to ammunition and doctrine, but to the eccentric mind that took broken things and welded them into a kind of answer. Clint's stupid trick was an argument against the idea that only superior firepower decides battles. It was a reminder that ingenuity, misdirection, and the stubbornness to overturn a joke into a weapon could change a line on a map. When the campaign moved on, when Sicily's hills faded behind the columns, and the men boarded ships for the next fight, the memory of that night lingered like a scar. Clint Walker never sought medals. He went back to tuning radios, patching engines, and dreaming up new stupid contraptions for the engineers as they followed the campaign into Italy. His name appeared in a field report as the originator of an improvised demolition team's success, and that notation was folded into a file and filed away, a bureaucratic punctuation mark in a war that made punctuation out of lives. But the men who had been there remembered. They told the story to new replacements with the same half-laugh that had greeted Clint the day he strapped the contraption into the Jeep, a laugh that acknowledged both the audacity of an idea and the fragility of humanity beneath steel. They remembered the smell of burned fuel, the orange flare of an engine deck rupturing, the way metal sang as armor fractured and collapsed. They remembered a day in July 1943 when 5 German Panzers, confident and lethal, were undone by a ragged chain of explosives and by the imagination of a technician who refused to accept the obvious truce of force. In letters home, some men would say that luck and the gods had smiled. Others would say a man named Clint Walker had outsmarted the battlefield. The truth, as so often in war, lived in the overlap. A man with grease under his nails and a strange sense of humor. A scrap heap of metal, the predictable curiosity of soldiers, and a moment when the world tilted and a road was cleared. That road flowed onward into the long, hard months that followed, into Monte Cassino and Normandy, and the long march across Europe. And in the ledger of small, decisive actions, Clint's stupid trick took its place as both a joke and a lesson. He would tell no tall tales about glory. He would only later, when someone asked how in the hell it had worked, shrug and say that the enemy had been greedy and predictable, and that sometimes the stupidest idea, when stitched together properly, is the only one that keeps men alive.